Good morning. My name is Kathy Campbell, and I'm here having a conversation this morning with Susan Haworth, who works with blended families. And Susan and I ran into each other and decided we needed to have a further conversation because we do a lot of work with similar populations, and yet we're in different sides of that work, I guess. So, Susan, I was wondering, can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Oh, thanks, Kathy. This is such a treat, really, to be able to have this conversation. So I help step families. I help stepmoms and their partners with the process, navigating that crazy process of forming and maintaining an equitable and sustainable step family. That's a mouthful, I know. The challenges are, living with somebody else's children. They come all at once, fully formed usually. And then, of course, co-parenting with another household. And that's in about 90% of the cases because they're formed as a result of divorce, 10% formed as a result of death. So it's very complicated. And the dynamics are very different from a first family. So that's how I work. I provide individual counseling and coaching, and I do work with couples, and I have a few support groups. So yeah, and we intersect, as you said. We work with the same population. So this is should be very valuable for all of our clients.
I'm hoping so because we were talking about that just a little bit and how oftentimes I'm seeing the families kind of first, they'll come to me, they get through that divorce process. And as the families come together, when we have new step families, then they're coming to you. And our goal in a perfect world is they're working with you and they don't come back to see me. So we're not having them in court again.
Yeah, yeah. And I know that even in the divorce process, there are step families forming in the background sometimes.
Yes, yes. And I should say just it's just for the record, so to speak, that I work mostly in out of court. So I actually am a certified family law specialist, and I practice mostly in the San Jose area. And as we discussed before, I don't work in court for the most part anymore. I work exclusively now in mediation and collaborative cases. And I do that because it provides so much more flexibility to families, and we can actually really work with families in the kind of the root of the problem, if you will, which is why I loved talking with you about working with blended families because there's so much difficulty working through a court process in the best of circumstances. It's difficult to be a parent in the best of circumstances. And so I found in my own practice that working with families out of court was better for those families. But we were also talking about how when you've got step families, it's challenging because the step parents often don't have a place in the court process. They're excluded from that process completely.
Exactly.
And I'm guessing that impacts the work you do a lot.
It does. It's very frustrating for the stepmothers that I work with because they don't have a say. I mean, not even, we're talking above and beyond the court process. They don't have a say in a lot of things. There's a powerlessness that comes with the role, feeling out of control. And of course, when there is wrangling with the legal system, that's even exacerbated.
Right.
So that's, one of the questions I had for you, Kathy, is what role, if any, how can step parents be supportive without being front and center in the legal process?
Yeah, I think part of I'm guessing most of that really comes from the same advice that you would give. And that is really acknowledging that they don't have the ability to impact the outcome in a court process. And at the same time, recognizing that they are hopefully supportive of their partner and their partner's children. I think acknowledging the role that they play is going to be secondary and supportive at the same time knowing that their role is still important. Oftentimes when if we have a blended family that has formed while we're in the middle of this divorce process, we actually will speak to those roles in our judgments or parenting plans. And part of that is really to memorialize the expectation for most families that the biological parents are the ones that will be making those decisions. And it can specify the situations in which a step parent might become involved. So, obviously, an emergency situation, you want that step parent protecting the children in any way necessary. at the same time, they're not going to be stepping in necessarily in day-to-day discipline, which, I mean, right there, that tells me you're going to have a lot of issues to work with when you're working with families. How do you navigate the daily life of having a child that you really don't have the ability to discipline or
Right. That is the challenge, is that stepmothers in particular, they have a lot of responsibilities. They're given a lot of responsibilities, but they don't have authority.
Yes.
And that's a very tricky tightrope, so to speak, to
Yeah.
walk. And part of that is education of, we'll call them divorced dads for the purpose of this discussion, is that, you know, it's up to the divorced dads would love for the stepmoms to take on as much as they are willing to.
Right.
You know, you need help as a single parent.
Oh, absolutely.
And so it's incumbent on them to not give the stepmom more than she needs to take on. You know, not overload her with not ask her to do the disciplining, not, you know, putting so much on her plate, but that he needs to step up to his role. And I, you know, this is I'm generalizing, obviously,
Of course.
because not all divorced dads do that, not all stepmoms do that, but the divorce rate, as you know, for step families is ridiculously high.
Yeah, it is.
And it has been that way for 30 years that I know about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's around 85% of
It, you know, it varies depending how you're looking at it. Because for a lot of step families, they don't, because they're a little gun shy, you know, they don't get legally married. And, you know, we don't know if those are the ones that fall apart, you know, more frequently. We don't know this. I mean, I don't know this, maybe you do. So it's a hard statistic to nail down.
Yeah.
But we know it's much higher than first
Yeah, yeah. And that actually, I do work with families in that situation. And I also work with families who actually never marry. They have a child in common and ultimately have, they don't, the relationship ends, but they're still parents, they're still co-parents. And that's another population with whom I work, because we can still do what we call parentage actions, which are paternity is the more common name. But those are, as an aside, a lot of people think I don't really need anything. And so they just try to make it work. And while I applaud their tenacity, there's a number of reasons why they really should be getting in to see an attorney and get a judgment of parentage. So they're both legally recognized as parents, because birth certificates are not enough. So that's one bit that's really important for parents to know. But the other part is still they have all of the same challenges with co-parenting. And then if their relationship has ended, they're moving on to other relationships. You're dealing with the same dynamics that even though they weren't married, that part isn't necessarily part of the dynamic challenge. The dynamic challenges exist regardless. It's really those relationships where you have spouse or partners that are competing for kind of a time and attention of the other parent. The kids, of course, also competing. So there's all these dynamics that exist, whether it's a divorced family or a family that was never married.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about that, Kathy. I know that you are licensed in California, and so this is particular probably to California, although it's probably not that different in other states, is it?
It's ironically, California is actually, I think, ahead of the game in a lot of those areas. So one of the places that the paternity pieces show up is in same-sex couples, and ultimately the reality is that even though in California there is a legal path for making sure both of those parents are legal parents, regardless of how conception occurred, there's a path to do that in a number of ways. So here in California, you could actually do a parentage action and be fine. You have a judgment. But what we're finding is that other states will not necessarily honor that judgment. No, that's not appropriate legally. They're supposed to honor that judgment, but for whatever reason, they don't. So we are actually recommending oftentimes that you combine that with an adoption. So that's slightly different than what we were talking about, but it is another place where the paternity or parentage can come up. And so I definitely want to just highlight that, because I think ultimately we need to be more mindful for families of whatever configuration. They do have unique concerns. And so if you have a couple that was never married, if they're same gender couples, unfortunately, the political climate in our country often dictates that they should also be doing an adoption proceeding, which isn't necessarily true for heterosexual couples. I'm not a fan of that reality, but it is the reality. And so that's part of it. And I do think the other piece that, whether it's a heterosexual couple or a same-sex couple, it's ultimately the challenges of co-parenting are going to be the same on a day-to-day level. How do we meet the children's needs? I think one of the challenges that can come up, though, is that sometimes the gender issues, same-sex issues come up and are exploited by partners at different times. And so that's a unique challenge to that population that I think needs to be brought to light, because I do think it gets exploited and it gets manipulated and it gets used in not so great ways. Not always, but I have seen it happen. And so something for families to be aware of.
Yeah. And it's my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the divorce rate for same gender families is higher?
I haven't heard that statistic, so I don't. There are, I've helped a number of same-sex couples through divorce, and so for me, it's always interesting, because most of the time the issues, there's no difference. The one thing I would say is that sometimes we have issues if someone is not out, for example, at work, and there are threats being made. Those kinds of things I think are unique to the family. That family dynamic, for the most part, they're often the same, and ultimately it's unfortunate that those kinds of things get brought into this process. But it's, there are other pieces brought into hetero couples where there are unique elements of personalities on one or both sides there that are manipulated, and so in that respect, it is no different than other couples, but it's something for which families can be aware of. But it also brings us back to the challenges of the work that you do, where people are having all of these other elements or dynamics coming into the relationships and impacting how people work together or co-parent.
Absolutely. So I'm at the stage right now where I keep further parsing the population that I work with, segregating them for their own support that they need. So, for example, I have a monthly free support group for stepmoms that I do. Been doing that for a few years. And then I have two for my clients that are much smaller, more intense. And one is for stepmoms who have children of their own, biological children of their own. And one is for stepmoms who don't have children of their own. And it feels like that is, they have some different issues going on, and different dynamics. And now I'm considering having a support group for stepmoms who don't have biological moms in the picture, because the step family was formed due to death, not divorce. So, there's clearly overlap in what their challenges are, but there's some unique challenges too.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, drill down a little bit more on the unmarried ex-couples.
Yeah.
And so do you, in your process, there are different guidelines, I understand. And again, I could be wrong about this, about child support and custody for unmarried couples versus married couples.
The biggest difference would be in that for married couples, you would also have the element of income sharing with spousal support. And so that part would not be present in most of the couples that are unmarried. So, but generally speaking, child support is going to be calculated using those guidelines, which really is going to look at, the income that each party has, how much time each parent spends with the kids, what kind of deductions do you have? Do you have health insurance? Are you contributing to a 401k? Do you have mandatory retirement contributions to like PERS or STIRS? So there's a number of kind of consistent elements that are included in that and ultimately can be used to do the calculations. In my practice, we tend to focus more on kind of a holistic approach, and we often will have families create budgets and really look at, okay, now that we've got budgets for each household, here's A, here's B, this is how much money we need for both. Let's put the income in the same one single pot and then figure out how to share it. So the advantage of that is that oftentimes when we're doing the support calculations and using this formulaic approach, one person is going to be unhappy. Sometimes in that approach, both people are very unhappy. And when we do it from the other approach, we often have then and are able to really shift the focus to the kids, plural or child, so that both parents are not focusing on what the other parent is getting or doing. It's really focusing on the needs of the child. And that's the piece that I think is most important, whether it's if they're unmarried or married, separated, divorced, it's focusing on the children is the way that's the common goal. And I think that's true for blended families of any configuration. You're going to have that focus on the kids. And in my practice, I really try to focus on the kids because I think that is where we can make a lot more progress more quickly.
Yeah, that's great. That's such a good point to keep in mind for step parents. One of the things that my goal in life maybe is to untangle the relationship between the stepmom and the biological mom.
Yes.
It is fraught oftentimes. And it's like what I always say, it's like we're following central casting, that role, that script that has been set for us. So, and I think the irony of it is that both the biological mom and the stepmom are really wanting to do what's best for the children. Yeah. And so they should be allies.
Yeah.
Not enemies.
Which is part of the reason why I really am partial to doing the out-of-court processes, because we have the space and the ability to really focus on those relationships. And part of, the way I look at this and talk about it with my clients is that you're not going to stop being a family on the other side of this process. Your family is going to look different. You're going to be configured differently, but you're not going to stop being family. And that's true with when you have a stepmom and a biological mom, and that commonality is that child or children. So part of the reason I like this process is I know we talked about the reality that there's a lot of modifications that happen as step families, grow or come together. However that happens, it does result in a lot of modifications. And again, we come to that same challenge, is that there's not really a lot of space for the step parents of any kind in a court process. And doing the out-of-court processes, we have that space, we have that ability to bring all players to the table. So we can sit at a table and talk about co-parenting with the stepmother, with the biological mother, with all four parents. So if there are, a stepmom and a bio dad and a, two stepmoms on the other side, they can all come together and sit at the table. And the success rate for those types of conversations is so much higher because you're dealing with some of the underlying challenges. We're not going to solve every problem. We're not going to fix all of the relationship challenges, but we can at least identify some of those challenges and start to provide some tools. And at the very least, you could speak to this part better than I, but oftentimes when we identify patterns, that's so important to families because they don't even realize that's what's going on. It's that central casting piece again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what I've heard you say about normalizing the conflict.
Yes.
Because that's what I do too, and it's such a relief for parents to realize this is not unique to you.
No.
This is part of the dynamic is, understanding how a step family, what the challenges are going to be in most cases.
Yes. And I think it's human nature. I see it in the divorce cases. I see it in step families. I see it in the world. It's so much easier to look outward and villainize and blame someone else. And oftentimes it's because there's a problem and it isn't necessarily that person's fault or even your own fault. It's that there isn't a known solution. How do we deal with this? And I don't know how to deal with it, so it must be your fault and your problem. But ultimately, when we can work through some of those things and normalize what the conflict is, how much the conflict is, what the types of conflict are, that just takes the temperature down in the room so much. And it helps people relax, because I think people do feel like if there is conflict, I don't know how to stop it. I don't know all the sources of the conflict. I just know it exists. I think there's often that kind of fear that, oh my gosh, I must be part of it. And so if we can actually relax, bring the fear and the temperature down, then it allows each of the parents to kind of sit back, get back into their logical brain, stop reacting from the kind of fight or flight. And then we can actually have these conversations. And, part of what I love about this job is I do so much of it with counselors in the room. So I get to listen and learn pieces of this. So most of the time when that's happening, me as a lawyer, I'm sitting back and letting the work happen with the magic of the counselors. But it is a magic that happens because seeing people relax and start to get back to that logical brain and begin to problem solve as partners, as equals, even if they are a stepmom and working with a biological mom, they still can come to this as partners because they both still share that goal of making sure the kids are okay. So to me, that's where the magic really happens, and why I love doing the work I do is because I can make a change, not just in the moment in this process, but in their lives going forward. And I know that's the impact you have on families as well.
Yeah. So Kathy, in your process, how often do you have biological moms and stepmoms coming together and talking?
Honestly, not enough. So it's most of the time when we have people coming back, it's going to be the biological parents that are going to come back to talk to us about how to deal with these changes. I would love, and that's really one of the reasons why I was excited to talk to you, is I would love to be able to encourage families to come in and talk to us, because there is not that way to resolve problems inside the court process, because it doesn't involve all of the people involved in that child's life. I think this process, I admit my bias up front. I love working out of court much more. There's absolutely a need for court process, absolutely. At the same time, I prefer working with families out of court. And in a blended family, step family situation, there's so much more need for that, because you cannot just deal with the biological parents, and working with the two of them in a vacuum is just, I don't want to say it's a waste of time, but you're not really addressing all of the dynamics.
Right, right. And that's especially true if for example, the stepmom is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Yeah.
In her role. Yeah. So it would be, here's our fantasy, right? If we could be proactive, if we could bring the bio mom and the stepmom together at the early stages.
Yes.
To work as a team. What I notice, Kathy, is the common enemy effect. So that because there's a contentious divorce, right, between the two, the original couple, I'll call them, that the stepmom will think that it is her job to be on the side of her partner, right, in having a common enemy, the ex-spouse.
Yeah.
And I think we can do better than that.
I completely agree. And I would say the cases that I have worked on with step parents where things actually were, I think, healthy for everyone involved, were those situations where the stepmom could push back against, in at least two of the cases I'm thinking about, her new partner, because that really gave the new partner a reality check, and it actually took them out of that kind of really convenient space of, oh, she's the enemy and I don't have to listen to or think about anything she says. Having a stepmom who can have that perspective, that's so helpful and so important, because that stepmom is actually much more likely to get the buy-in of her new partner, the original, in this case, father. I think that's so important. I think that gets lost because most of the time, well, I'm thinking of two cases in particular that were especially conflicted. There was a very strong stepmother who was very much involved, and the biological mom, through no fault of her own, had not been involved in recent years. And so as the biological mom is coming back into the conversation, there was definitely some resistance. But the stepmom could actually speak to the father and say, you know what, she's an important part of your daughter's life, and your daughter needs her, and your daughter needs that relationship to be a strong one. So we need to be supportive of that relationship because it's best for our daughter. Maybe it doesn't work for you and I so much, but our daughter needs that. And we really need to focus on it for that reason. It made all the difference in the world.
That person is not my client.
That person is unusual. I have to acknowledge it's not the common person I see either, but that's the ideal. That's the fantasy, as you said.
That's what we're going for.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because in my practice, you know, I frequently think, oh my gosh, I get asked legal questions, and I always say, I am not a lawyer, but I wish I were, you know, because, you know, things come up all the time. For example, one of the issues is, and I tell people a lot, there is no statute of limitations for back child support. But someone recently asked me, what if you have no agreement in the first place?
Yeah, that's tough, because if you don't have an agreement, then any child support you get is going to be, I don't want to say this, but by the grace of the paying parent. The reality is you have to have an order in place. And what has gotten better in recent years, when I first started practicing, this might date me a little more than I want, but when I first started practicing, we didn't really have a super active Department of Child Support Services. The federal government got behind it many years ago and started really putting dollars into it so that the states could develop these processes to come in and really assert child support on behalf of the children. So that's much more common, and it is often part of any process of a divorce, for sure, certainly. That will ultimately get an order in place, which means you then could go back and collect unpaid child support. If it hasn't been formalized into a written agreement, that's going to be hard to do. By the same token, if you have a child support order and you've reached an agreement, you have to memorialize that agreement in writing. One of the first cases I ever had was a guy who had come to me because he had what was alleged to be an $86,000 child support arrearage. And he said, I have paid her every month religiously. What did you pay her? Well, we agreed back in the child was 5 years old that we could reduce it because she had a wealthy husband. They never changed it. They never changed it in the court. And so he ended up having to pay that back. And the really big salt in the wound is that the statutory interest rate is so high. It is 10%, and you can't waive it. You cannot get rid of that child support interest. So that's my biggest message of this is please get those orders modified. Please do get an order in the first place, because that's what's going to protect the ability to get that child support.
Yeah. I remind people because I know many cases where it was brought. Actually, one case where it was 40 years later.
Oh, wow.
The man was in his 80s.
Wow. Yeah. And there's a legal doctrine called latches, which is basically you cannot be sitting around. You have rights. You need to work actively, proactively to assert those rights. And so sometimes the latches doctrine will come into play and they'll say you've waited too long. But most of the time, those are older cases. Child support is such an important right of the children that the courts are really strongly assertive of that. And that's a big part of why the Department of Child Support Service exists. It's ultimately to protect the kids.
Right. And what about custody modifications? What have you seen there?
This is another place where I really wish that I could help. I could sit in a courthouse and say, come talk to us over here, because this is another place where it's years of conflict that fuel whatever is underlying any request at any given time. And when you're not really addressing some of those unhealthy communication patterns, unhealthy interactions, those things persist years and years and years down the road, which ultimately then harms the kids the most. So part of the modification process in my mind is really getting to understand what underlies the conflict. And we do have a process, and I'm in practice in Santa Clara County, where we do a lot of custody evaluations. And custody evaluations are generally having a mental health professional come in, meet with both parents, do home observations, maybe talk to the children's teacher, the pediatrician, whoever, and just collect as much data as possible about that family, and then to make recommendations that the court can either adopt or not. And then oftentimes one party's unhappy with that recommendation and a trial ensues. Those are also the cases that are going to be modified again and again and again and again down the road. And so part of my approach tends to be, let's really talk about what underlies the conflict here. Let's get to the bottom of this, because you're not going to be able to resolve things in a cooperative way that benefits the children if we can't. And so a lot of the work we do in a collaborative case or even mediation cases, I will bring in coaches to help them. And that is one of the things, is talk to the kids. Where are the kids at? Because at any given age, the kids are going to have a different perspective than the parents, certainly. As the kids get older, their needs are going to change dramatically. For example, with the teens, their parents are no longer their primary interest. They really, I mean, I have kids who are in their 20s now, but I remember when my kids were teens and it was like, see you later, mom. I'll let you know when I need some money and then I'll come back. But otherwise I'm going to be off doing my own thing with my friends. And that's another place where the challenges come up a lot, because the kids will start to pull away from both parents, and each parent asserts that it's that parent pulling the kid away. And it's, this is part of the normal development process. And being able to share that with parents, again, takes the fear down and helps them kind of relax a little bit. Oh, this is just what they're supposed to be doing at this time. This is them expressing or trying to assert their independence. Those are all things that I think are so important to know, that often get left out of those modification processes. And that's what makes it so hard, because they can continue to have these assumptions.
Yeah. Gosh, I have so many questions about custody, really. So in California, custody cases first have to go through mediation, right? Before they go to a court.
Correct.
So in your case, though, I mean, what percentage do you think of cases are resolved in mediation?
That's a really hard question to answer, because oftentimes what ends up happening in all of my cases, we resolve it before going to court. They don't ever have to see a mediator because they actually resolve it. So when I'm doing a mediation or collaborative case, with rare exception, we actually have agreements, because we're working with mental health professionals who perform the same functions as the mediator, or the family court services mediator in this case. But they're actually able to spend more time with the family, because family court services, you get a very limited amount of time with the mediator. You might get an initial hour session, and maybe if you're lucky, another session down the road, but that's generally all you're going to get. And so it's insufficient to try and help a family navigate a divorce, navigate all of the parenting challenges. Try to do that in 1 hour. I mean, that would be a miracle worker. So, and we do have some of those miracle workers, thankfully. But generally speaking, in my processes, we do have other miracle workers who have more time to work with the family. So we're able to work much broader agreements and address a lot of the underlying issues. So we don't have a lot of modifications in these out-of-court processes. Most of those are going to be ones that were litigated in the first place. But again, I'd love to bring them back into the fold of doing an out-of-court process, because we can give it a much more individualized attention.
I'm remembering, Kathy, this was some years ago when my daughter was quite young. She had a friend. We lived in Georgia, in Atlanta. And she had a friend who was 14. They were both teenagers. And her friend, her parents were divorced. And at that time, I don't know if it's changed, 14-year-olds could decide which parent to live with out of court. They didn't have to go before a judge. They could just decide. And this young woman, she probably regrets it now, bounced back and forth between parents. When one parent annoyed her, she went to the other one. Yeah. And I was even, back then I realized how destructive that was for her relationship, for the parents' relationship. I hope that has changed now, but I don't know. I don't live obviously in Georgia any longer. So, yeah.
California, we have a different approach. So the way the statute reads is, I believe the words are due consideration. And so the court must consider at age 14 and older what the kids' preferences are. Doesn't mean that the judge is going to go with it, but the other reality is we talk about how that information gets to the judge, because even that part of the process can actually introduce a lot of unwelcome elements, if you will. I mean, if you have a 14-year-old who is kind of a meek and shy child, go and testify in front of a judge, go meet with the judge in chambers, have a conversation with the judge in chambers with the court reporter. Like, all of those are ways that could get that information to the judge, could give the judge that kind of FaceTime with the child to give the judge the opportunity to assess, kind of, is this a child wise beyond their years? Are they making this judgment for really good reasons? Or are they simply bouncing back and forth between mom and dad because mom said the wrong thing, so now I go to dad? Those are all parts of what I think go into a lot of the judge's consideration of what a 14-year-old wants. The challenge is oftentimes the 14-year-old gets pulled into this process as a pawn and ultimately feels pressure from either or both parents to say X or Y. Generally, you want to be with me, you want to be with me. Those are the things where the judges generally are not going to bring the child's voice in, because they don't want that child to be pulled into the conflict. And so in our process out of court, we use what we call a child specialist, who is someone who has worked in the forensic realm and actually speaks with the kids and does 1 or 2 sessions to get to know them and to build that rapport, and then be able to talk to them about what it is they want and why, and to kind of fulfill that role, but in hopefully a much less uncomfortable setting. And then that particular professional can come back and share that information with the parents. Because if you were to have this conversation with the child and then, okay, now the child has to tell the parents, you've just undone whatever you did. So this is one of the tools we use in the processes that has helped a lot, because then it's a message that the parents believe, but it also takes it out of, well, you told her to say that, you told him to say that. It's ultimately something that parents can go, oh, I didn't know that. How do we make it better? How do we change it? How do we do something that works for the child?
Yeah. I don't know if I had shared this with you before, but I write an advice column for Stepmom magazine called the Stepmom Whisperer. So I get questions from people all over the place, all over the world, really. And occasionally I get a question about usually a teenager who is now refusing to come to one of the parents' house. They don't want to come they don't want to go back and forth.
Right.
I mean, we've got some crazy custody arrangements for kids, right? That aren't necessarily child-centric. They're, half the week you're here, half the week you're there. You forget all your clothes. You have to have 2 separate sets of clothes. So, and they say, can we force the child to, because it's part of the custody agreement? Well, first of all, the custody agreement is maybe 10 years old.
Right.
Yeah, there's there's a problem. And I always point out, what is to gain here?
Yeah.
From forcing a kid to come to your house because that's in the agreement. And so we get sort of caught up in power and control issues rather than focusing on what's really in the best interest of the child.
Or even maybe focusing on, why is it that they don't want to come to your house? Maybe there's some really good reasons that they're struggling with that. And if I have a child that's resisting coming to my house, I want to look into that. I want to understand why. And I do see that a lot, especially with parents who are more authoritarian. As kids get older, they just resist. And what I have seen happen, this is actually a bit of a unicorn. I had one case where the father was actually in recovery, was fairly new in recovery. When the case started, about a year in, he'd had a lot more recovery under his belt, had been sober for a year. He started to kind of back off and not push. And this is a father who was actually flying here to see the kids, and flying, it was actually twice a month, was flying out for the whole weekend, paying for a hotel room for himself and putting in a lot of effort to see the kids. And the kids were resisting and resisting and resisting. And finally he said, I don't want to push this, because then I just become a bigger burr under their saddle. And so instead, he would actually send articles to them. He would actually write cards to them. And he said he actually had more contact with the kids through this method than when he would fly out. He had better engagement, more conversations. He was reaching out to the teachers and doing parent-teacher conferences over the phone. He was following up on the curriculum that they were learning in school and would find articles to match and say, oh, hey, this is another angle on whatever it was you were studying in science. And I've always been struck by that because it was a very child-centric focus, and it's unique. And I think the unfortunate reality is we're, as parents, we're humans too. We have our own perspective and we make our own mistakes. And I know I sure did as a parent. The reality is we as a parents, as the adults, we need to try and figure out a way to shift so that we're focusing on the kids' needs. Because maybe it is just bouncing back and forth, trying to find the parent who's going to give me whatever it is I want. Or maybe there's some significant problems in one of the households. And so I don't think you can dismiss the child's perspective ever, because it's a symptom of something going on, whether it's good, bad, or ugly. You need to focus on that.
And one of the things I always say is it ain't over till it's over. So I have seen where a child has decided no more visits with, dad or mom or whatever, and then in later years reconcile.
Yeah.
So you don't know. And I love the story that you told, because it's something that I recommend is keep passing along those olive branches, keep extending them, and making overtures and gestures, and meet them where they are.
Yeah.
And then you have a better chance of having a better relationship down the road.
Yeah.
Taking the long view is what I recommend.
Absolutely. Because I think the more that parents force the kids, the easier it is for the kids to blame it on the parents and not look inward and try and resolve some of the issues that are going on for them. And so if you can step back and say, okay, when you're ready, you're ready. And that lets the kids, hopefully they're working on it's normal developmental things, and they grow through it, and then they come back to you, and that relationship is so much stronger because you've given them the space they needed. If you're pushing it, that's going to make it take that much longer, I think.
Yeah, and it is, and it builds resentment and hostility on all ends.
Yeah,
really, it just keeps the conflict going.
It does.
Yeah,
it's a tough thing. So, but ultimately, I think the part that I really try to impress upon families is that we are all human and we do all make mistakes, and that ultimately we want to do the best for our kids. And so I think focus on your kids first, and then focus on what you can do as a parent to be better, as a partner to be better. That's kind of my perspective, is when we do this with much more compassion, it makes the whole job so much easier. And
absolutely. Yeah, compassion and humility too.
Yes.
That is the other virtue that I try to approach things with, because I think I hear from step parents, well, that other person, the other party is crazy, they are bad parents, they do things differently, and so that makes them bad, because that's the unique thing about a step family is you're naturally going to have two sets of rules and protocols that the kids have to navigate, which is not easy.
No.
But it doesn't mean that the other side, you're doing it because you believe this is right, but who knows? Maybe you're wrong.
Right.
And you could, if you approach that with humility, that I think it opens things up a little bit.
It does. And I think the other part that always amazes me is the more humility that's introduced into a dynamic, the more people can back up and start taking responsibility. I think it makes space for that as well. And I think that's important too, because it's easier to build on that. You know what? I really messed that up. I'd like a do-over on that one. Can we try that again?
Oh my gosh. I think about that every day. I wish I had some do-overs.
If I could just have 5, if I could have 5, and I'd pick and choose, but haven't found those yet. So
no.
Susan, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I would love to do this again. I'm delighted to learn there's so many areas where we intersect and I think can help one another, help our respective clients have a happier and better life.
Well, that would be fabulous for me. This has been such a treat. Thank you, Kathy.
Yes, for me too. Thank you so much.